SWANN'S Way by Marcel Proust. The narrator, who will eventually become known as Marcel, opens the novel by revealing, "For a long time I used to go to bed early." He relates how difficult it was for him to fall asleep as a young boy. The narrator himself then seems to fall asleep, imagining that he is the subject of the book he was just reading, then opening his eyes to discover that he really had fallen asleep and has just woken himself up into darkness. Marcel is not so afraid of the dark as he is of losing his sense of time. He marvels at sleep's ability to rob people of their individuality, making them forget who they are when they wake and forcing them to piece together the different components of their lives. Despite these confused gusts of memory, the recurring nature of this confusion allows Marcel to get used to the dark surroundings and recall exactly where he fell asleep. The night, nevertheless, continues to set his memory in motion, and the narrator begins to recall the old days at Cambrai, Paris, Balbec, and Venice. Marcel recounts that whenever he visited his grandparents' house in the northern French village of Cambrai, his bedroom, in which his insomnia would keep him up all night long, would make him melancholic. In order to make him feel better, the young Marcel is given a magic lantern which projects pictures from children's stories onto his bedroom walls. This device, however, only makes Marcel unable to recognize his room underneath the shifting colors, and he soon begins to fear bedtime more than before. His only solace is the good-night kiss his mother gives him each night, even though he knows that his father disapproves of this ritual and that his mother secretly hopes that he will grow out of it. But Marcel comes to depend on these short but sweet kisses as though they were a life-saving medicine. The only nights his mother does not come to kiss him goodnight are those on which his family is entertaining guests, which invariably include Charles Swann. Swann's father and Marcel's grandfather had been very close, and Charles continues to visit and send gifts to Marcel's family, even though they do not approve of his marriage. No one knows that Charles has become an elite member of Parisian society, and is often seen with aristocrats and even royalty. As a result, Marcel's family continues to treat him with a comic indifference and slight rudeness that they consider appropriate toward a man of the middle class. However, everyone, except Marcel, looks forward to his visits and stories. Marcel knows that Swann's presence means that his mother will not kiss him goodnight. One night, when Marcel's father does not let Marcel even peck his mother on the cheek as he leaves for bed, Marcel decides to revolt. He has the maid, Françoise, take his mother, who is still entertaining Swann, a note begging her to come see him. At first Mama refuses, but once Swann has gone and she sees how miserable Marcel is, she decides to spend the night in his room. He is shocked when his father urges her to stay in Marcel's room. Even though Marcel feels victorious at first, he soon realizes that winning his mother's presence required his parents' acknowledgement that Marcel suffers from a nervous ailment. His guilt makes him cry even more, and his mother must read a book out loud to calm his nerves. The story returns to Marcel the narrator. Breaking with his usual habit one afternoon, Marcel drinks tea with a petite madeleine, or small sponge cake, which instantly soothes his daily troubles and eventually reminds him of a similar combination of cake and tea he used to enjoy at Cambrai. Marveling at the random connections between present and past and at the involuntary nature of memory, he sets out to describe his reminiscences of Cambrai. One of Marcel's most vivid memories of Cambrai involves his Aunt Léonie. Grief-stricken after the death of her husband, Léonie stays in bed all day with an acute case of hypochondria, hoping to earn the sympathy of her relatives by orally cataloging her ailments. Indeed, Marcel would often overhear her whispering to herself, "I must not forget that I never slept a wink." He would always kiss her good morning and join her for her morning ritual of dipping a madeleine in tea. Before being eventually transferred to Marcel's family, Françoise took care of Léonie, doing everything from preparing her meals to discussing the townspeople that walked by her window. Eugène, one of Léonie's friends, would come each Sunday afternoon to gossip about what had gone on during church. This thought brings the narrator to the subject of Cambrai's church and its Gothic architecture. Marcel marvels at the series of stained glass windows and tapestries that line the interior of the church, each telling a different story of kings, queens, and saints. But the church steeple remains the most beautiful aspect of the church in the narrator's memory. He compares its break in the Cambrai skyline to the last-minute touch of an artist in a painting. He goes on to describe the different variations of colors that reflect off its roof tiles at different hours of the day. Marcel relates how the only room at his grandparents' house that he was not allowed to enter was the study of his uncle Adolphe, in which he used to read. The growing Marcel loves the theater, carefully planning which plays he will go see while reading playbills on Paris streets. He hopes to discuss a play with his uncle one specific day, but there is another visitor at the house. Marcel does not realize that the guest is a prostitute, and goes out of his way trying to impress her, even kissing her hand. His uncle is visibly embarrassed, and sends Marcel away telling him not talk about their meeting with his parents. When Marcel innocently mentions what happened later that evening, his father and grandfather end up having violent words with his uncle, whom Marcel never sees again. Because of Adolphe's shameful behavior, his study at Cambrai is closed up and no one is allowed inside. Left with very few places to read, Marcel often takes his books outside into the garden. His passion for reading, matched only by his growing love of art and Italian frescoes, to which Swann introduces him, allows him to become invisible to the rest of the outside world as he hides with his books under a chestnut tree. He finds that books bring him closer to truth and beauty, especially in the overwhelming power of their presence in literature in contrast to their scant appearance in the real world. Marcel finds fictional characters, for example, infinitely more sympathetic and understandable than any real individual of indefinite personality. Since the character in a novel is mainly the reader's own creation, he feels, the sensations and emotions evoked by the experiences of that character become so powerfully succinct and condensed that the reader learns more than he or she normally would from individuals in the real world. Marcel's world of books suddenly expands when Swann and his friend Bloch introduce him to the writer Bergat. Even though Marcel's grandfather makes fun of Bloch's Jewish heritage, he is a welcome guest at Cambrai until one day he jokes about Aunt Leonie's wild youth and the family no longer admits him into their home. But Marcel remembers Bloch fondly because they share a love for the writer Bergat, whose archaic expressions Marcel admires. Marcel even finds himself weeping over lines of Bergat's that resemble thoughts he confuses for his own. It turns out that Swann is actually a close friend of Bergat, who spends a lot of time with Gilbert, Swann's daughter. Unfortunately, Marcel is not allowed to meet Gilbert because his family disapproves of Madame Swann, who appears to be having an affair with Swann's friend M. de Charles. Despite the world of differences that separates them, Marcel feels a strange closeness to Gilbert and her unknown life. This last part of the Cambrai section focuses on many of the local characters that not only influenced Marcel as a child, but who will figure quite prominently in both his and Swann's adult love affairs. One of these, Vinteuil, is a local musician who has a reputation for prudishness and extreme moral rectitude. From the moment Vinteuil is introduced, Marcel spies on him. One day, as his parents pay a visit to Vinteuil's house, Marcel watches through the window as Vinteuil places a sheet of music he has written on his piano so that someone will ask him to play. Vinteuil's one and only passion, however, is his daughter. Despite the fact that the narrator assesses Emelie Vinteuil as having a boyish appearance, Vinteuil takes every opportunity to pamper her. The narrator introduces another character, Legrandin, as the quintessential example of French middle-class snobbery. Marcel's family takes great offense when Legrandin refuses to introduce them to his sister. As the narrator reflects on the stunning natural beauty of Cambrai, he begins to describe the charming walks he would take either alone or with his family, either along Germetti's Way or Swann's Way. The latter is the shorter and more common route for the family. It is also Marcel's favorite because of the gorgeous pink hawthorn blossoms that line its path during the spring and summer. The fragrance of these hawthorn blossoms overwhelms the impressionable young Marcel, who begins to worship the hawthorn trees as if they were religious icons. One day, mistakenly thinking that Odette and her daughter, Gilbert, are away, his family cuts across Swan's property and accidentally runs into them and Charles. Marcel thinks that Gilbert looks at him with disgust and instantly falls in love with her. He is so impressed with her beautifully piercing black eyes that he mistakenly imagines her eyes to be blue from then on. The two groups part ways, but not before Marcel's grandfather scolds Odette in front of her daughter for cheating on Swann. When Vintuel pities Swann, later that week, for making such a deplorable marriage, the narrator accuses Vintuel of hypocrisy, since a woman of bad repute has moved into his house and become his daughter's lover. Vintuel grows old within the space of a few months and eventually dies of a broken heart. Shortly after Vintuel's death, Marcel ends up spying on Emelie Vintuel and her lover just outside an open window. He is shocked to see them kiss and then mock the recently deceased Vintuel. They close the window just as one of them proposes that they spit on his photograph. The narrator concludes that Emelie Vintuel had become a sadist and saw pleasure itself as something inherently diabolical and evil. The young Marcel endures a second disappointment following his brief encounter with Gilbert. The Duchess of Gramentiz comes to the Cambrai church for a wedding, but Marcel, who was expecting her to be as beautiful as her ancestors depicted on the church tapestries, is surprised to find that her looks are only ordinary, and ends up disillusioned with her physical appearance. Confronted with the real Duchess of Gramentiz in front of the images of her ancestors in stained glass windows and tapestries, Marcel compares her to a betrayed actress, with her true identity suddenly revealed on stage. Just as with Gilbert, he imagines that the Duchess has blue eyes in order to remember her as more beautiful than she actually is. The narrative proceeds to a time 15 years prior to Marcel's youth at Cambrai to focus on the beginning of the love affair between Odette and Swann. At that time, Odette belonged to a clique of mediocre, middle-class social climbers who came together each night at the Verdurin's salon. Each night, a trio consisting of a doctor, a painter, and a musician makes the Verdurins believe that they are much more important than they really are. Even though Odette is merely an aspiring courtesan, she is welcome to bring whomever she likes to the Verdurins. Swann is not impressed with Odette at first, finding himself indifferent to her appearance. Knowing that she likes him, however, makes him begin to pay increasingly more attention to her. When a friend leads Swann to believe that Odette will be harder to seduce than she really is, he begins to fall in love with her. Swann makes a good impression with the Verdurins because he is an expert socialite who knows how to speak and act as others wish him to. Madame Verdurin is extraordinarily shallow and prone to hysteria, but her taste in music amuses Swann. She asks the musician to play a sonata that Swann had previously attempted, unsuccessfully, to find for the purpose of studying. Swann does not know much about music, and is at first confused by the progression of the sonata. Gradually, however, he feels successive sensations of pleasure, melancholy, passionate longing, and finally, rejuvenation. After explaining to Odette that he had previously heard the sonata and fallen in love with it, he is surprised to learn that the composer's name is Vintuel. He is positive, though, that it is not the same Vintuel he knows from Cambrai. Swann makes such a good impression on the Verdurins that he is invited to join their salon. He tries as hard as possible to hide his connections to the Prince of Wales and the President of France in order to seem more like the regulars at the Verdurins. However, he rarely stays for dinner, despite Odette's entreaties. In fact, Swann is also seeing a local seamstress and does not really take Odette's advances too seriously. But she eventually conquers him by having the Verdurins' musician play Swann's favorite sonata whenever they are together. Swann finally visits Odette's house and sympathizes with her desperate attempts to please him. He forgets his cigarette case there, and she writes to him, "If only you had forgotten your heart. I should never have let you have that back." One day, Swann realizes that Odette looks like Jethro's daughter in Botticelli's painting Zipporah. Associating her with this idealized beauty, Swann falls hopelessly in love with Odette. He searches for her desperately that night in the streets of Paris. He finds her, and they spend the night together. Swann continues to associate Vintuel's mysterious sonata with his love for Odette. Despite Odette's vile inability to play the sonata correctly, Swann feels the music lifting his spirits and making his love for her appear stronger than anything else in the world. When Odette's love for Swann seems to have diminished, the sonata becomes a sort of anesthetic that makes Swann feel better. This last quality becomes essential to their love's duration, as Swann becomes more and more jealous and suspicious of Odette as time goes on. Indeed, she asks him not to mention her name to anyone in society for fear that it might revive scandalous rumors about her past. Swann nevertheless continues to accede to Odette's every demand, not realizing that, in his attempts to accommodate her, he also makes her think less of him. Swann's love for Odette grows so strong that he soon alters his own tastes, opinions, and habits to imitate hers. Devoid of any experiential grounding, these aspects of personality that Swann adopts serve only to remind him of Odette. Further, he soon grows to adore the Vergerins by extension, since their fondness for Odette mirrors his own love for her, and because they allow them to meet at their house every night. Unfortunately for Swann, the Vergerins do not return his affections. They think of him as a locked door who secretly scorns their tastes and dinner guests. They also grow upset at rumors that Swann is a favorite guest at aristocratic salons. Compared to their latest newcomer, the Comte de Forcheville, Swann appears to them a poor match for their beloved Odette. Forcheville not only embarrasses Swann one night at dinner by referring to Swann's aristocratic friends, but also begins to seduce Odette, who leaves reluctantly with Swann. The Vergerins begin to call Swann, their most devoted guest, stupid. Swann's expert tact and refined manners keep him from confronting Odette about her supposed liaison with Forcheville. Whenever Swann starts to lose his temper with Odette, he responds by buying her jewelry or loaning her large sums of money, hoping that these gifts, as a last resort, might make him attractive to her. Moreover, he worries that if he stops being so generous to her, she might suspect that his love for her was declining. The slightest public avowal of love from Odette always calms the storm of jealousy brewing in Swann's mind, but one night she sends him away because she doesn't feel well. Suspecting that someone else is coming to spend the night with her, he goes back to her house later, even though Odette has often warned him how much she despises jealous lovers who spy. At first Swann thinks that the light is on and that she has deceived him, but he then realizes that he has the wrong address. Without thinking, Odette asks Swann to post a letter for her address to Forcheville. Swann's jealousy gets the better of him, and, holding the envelope to the light, he discovers that Odette had spent the previous evening with Forcheville. He is incensed, but reflecting on Odette's tone in the letter, Swann decides that her old letters to him were much more affectionate. His jealousy now has something to feed on and begins to take on a life of its own, fixating on the hour of the day that Odette spent with Forcheville. Odette's tacit rejection of Swann stems in part from the Vergerins, who begin to push Swann out of their social circle and especially away from Odette, whom they are trying to fix up with Forcheville. Swann's heart breaks when the Vergerins tactlessly mention, in front of him, a large outing and dinner party to which he is conspicuously not invited. Swann becomes enraged and begins to see the Vergerins for what they really are. Fuming to himself, he calls Madame Vergerin a procuress and denounces her for pimping Odette to Forcheville. He declares to himself that it is high time that I stopped condescending to promiscuous intercourse with such infamy, such dung, even though, a few hours earlier, he would have laid down his life for either of the Vergerins. Later that night he blasts Odette for not refining her tastes during their relationship, and for not learning how to say no to the Vergerins. He begs her not to go see a trashy play with them that evening and threatens to think less of her if she does go. Odette does not quite understand what Swann is trying to tell her and runs off, explaining that she will be late for the overture. Swann nevertheless continues to love Odette, and his obsession begins to warp his perception of time. He compares their relationship to a railway schedule that mercilessly divides up their time together. It is only when Odette displays an unexpected kindness toward him that he suddenly realizes that they are sharing a real hour of her life and not just some artificial hour that has been invented for his special use. He has grown so used to jealousy that he begins to see their time together as separate and distinct from the parts of Odette's life that she spends with other people, those parts which really matter to her. When Odette asks Swann to stay a little longer than usual one night, and gives him something to drink, all he can think of is Forcherville sitting in the same chair and drinking from the same glass in Odette's real world. One day Odette sends Swann a letter asking if she can take the Vergerins to a Wagner concert that Swann has organized. She claims that she wants to do something for them, but also hints that Swann will not be desired company. Swann is so outraged that he swears off Odette for good. Within a few days, however, he cannot help but think of the other Odette, and through the chemical action of his jealousy, he soon feels tenderness and pity for her. His love for her has so far outgrown physical desire that Odette's appearance has become a detached externality that he considers irrelevant. Even when Swann tries to think of Odette as ugly, his love remains strong, since it has become so intertwined with his daily habits and actions that even death would be unable to strip it from him. His love was no longer operable, but rather wholly dysfunctional. Hopelessly in love with Odette, Swann encourages his best friend Charles to visit her, and sings Swann's praises whenever possible. One day he asks Charles to trick Odette into inviting Swann over, but the ruse fails. He even asks Marcel's uncle Adolphe to ask Odette about him, but later finds out that Adolphe tried to seduce her. Left to his own imagination, Swann cannot help but forget Odette's shortcomings and cast the rest in molten gold, seeing her as the perfect image of tranquility and kindness. Nevertheless, it becomes common for him to hear of Odette walking through Paris with another man, these words dropping into his heart like a stone and tearing at him from the inside out. Swann soon begins to worry that he has become neurotic. Despite Odette's harsh treatment of him, Swann does not realize how much he has suffered, since Odette's change of heart had been a gradual, day-by-day phenomenon. Only by comparing her to the Odette he had first known would Swann feel the deep wound of his love. But even then he would soothe it with the vague assertion that there was a time when Odette loved me more. For Swann soon grows to love his pain to such an extent that Vinteuil's sonata begins to speak to his vain sense of suffering. Whenever he hears the sonata's violin crescendo, Swann enjoys the sweet solace of utter self-pity. Some days, however, he grows so frustrated that he wishes Odette would die, but then becomes ashamed of himself for holding her life so cheap. One day he gets an anonymous letter telling him that Odette has been the mistress of countless men, including Forcherville and a number of the other guests of the Vergerins. He concludes that Charles sent the letter out of sympathy for Swann's suffering, but then tricks himself into believing that it could have been any of a number of people who held a grudge against Odette. Swann finally musters up the courage to confront Odette about her various lies and infidelities. He learns that her mother sold her to a wealthy Englishman in Nice, that she has had relations with other women, and that she had been Forcherville's lover. Swann's love for Odette expires when she reveals that the first night they made love, she had actually been with Forcherville earlier in the evening. Swann feels as though he has been struck by an axe. Whenever Swann thinks himself cured of Odette, he hears of her love for him and changes his mind about her. One day one of the Vergerins' old guests tells Swann how often Odette spoke of him and how much she still adores him. The infrequency of such remarks, to which Swann formerly gave so much weight, coupled with the fact that he hardly ever sees Odette anymore, makes Swann's love fade for good. When he no longer suffers the pangs of unrequited love, Swann declares, as if waking from a dream, "To think that I've wasted years of my life, that I've longed to die, that I've experienced my greatest love for a woman who didn't appeal to me, who wasn't even my type."